All right, so welcome everyone to our Bikes in Toronto seminar. This is our last seminar of 2021, which is very exciting. And I'm very excited to introduce our speakers today. And I want to give a huge shout out to Adonai Garcia, who's helped organize this and find such great speakers. And as well, a big shout out to our executive team at ITE and Kevin Gigrick, who's here as our faculty representative. So with no further ado, I'm gonna introduce our first speaker today. One second, which is Ersan Ozon. He works at his company Cycle York, and the topic he's gonna be talking about today is the comparison of social and physical cycling infrastructure in Uptown and Downtown Toronto. Cycle York Community Bike Center is located in the Black Creek neighborhood in Toronto. They're a DIY community bike space, cycling advocacy, education and social group running under Regenesis York that works towards advocating for cyclist needs and services in the community. They offer free access to repair facilities and mechanic instructors and offer cycling related events such as bike rides, learn to rides and workshops. So welcome Ersan Ozon, and I'll pass it on to you to share your screen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ersan. I'm the director for Cycle York. As Artem explained, we are a community bike shop located at the York University, Kiel campus. And maybe some of you all seen our storefront. It is by the Quad building on the intersection of Pond Road and yeah, it is by the Pond Road, right across the Tal building. So essentially at Cycle York, what we do is, I wanna start with that part, right? What we do at Cycle York. We are DIY oriented. So that means we help people learn the skills to fix their own bikes. We provide tools, we provide guidance, we provide expertise. So community members can come in, use the stands and can work on their own bikes. Obviously, this operation has been particularly affected by COVID restrictions. So now we do have a more appointment-based system where we are trying to space out between different appointments and create safety for everyone. Another thing we are proud of is we really do focus on recycling and essentially helping people use the old parts who then most of the time necessarily discard it and give a new life to them. So they will be bringing their own bikes and then swapping essentially a lot of the old parts with the parts that we provide in our space. We generally try to focus on the social infrastructure of things when you look at how different bike shops are located and serviced. So we are trying to give people education on safety, ridership, how to use the resources that are available in terms of cycling. And we take pride in that because we do think part of the development in the cycling community will stem from providing good social program. And we are nonprofit also, as a side note. So now I will start talking about a little bit about the social and physical infrastructure, what these structures are essentially, right? So when we talk about physical infrastructure, we are mostly talking about the roads, the motorways, essentially the space that cyclists can use with their bikes and commute, transit, and essentially most of this stuff is happening in the urban settings. So we are most of the time referring to the urban setting in regards to cycling, the roadways and essentially other physical infrastructure that is designed for cyclists in mind. But when we are talking about social infrastructure, it's a way larger scope, right? We are talking about education, we are talking about safety, we are talking about support, we are talking about activism, We are talking about how essentially one gets to a point where they actually ride their bike, or what they go through until the time they start riding their bike, or as they are riding their bike. So what I want to talk about is a little bit about how social infrastructure is bridging the gap between the cyclist and the physical infrastructure, and the importance of it, right? So when we talk about a cyclist, we are talking about many different individuals, but we want to narrow that down a little bit today. So we will be talking about solely, most of the time, using people who are using bikes as a mode of transit, because most of the time in the urban settings, those are the people experiencing most of the severe problems and connectivity problems, right? In a city, in an urban center. So part of the social infrastructure is giving people the right resources so that they feel comfortable taking the road, where they are surrounded with the cars sometimes, right? They are not always protected bike lanes. They are not always separated paths designed for cyclists. You sometimes have to take the roads. You sometimes have to take an intersection with the cars. You are essentially, as a cyclist, existing in an environment where there's a lot of unsafety already existing, right? And on the other part, we are talking about education, right? And then the access to the education and what bike hubs do in this sense. So when we are talking about these bike hubs and the programming they offer, and also we offer at Cycle York, we do try to focus on especially 2 or 3 important points, which are safety, education, and while doing this, we are trying to keep in mind that people do have different and various language needs. They do have different cultural perspectives. They do have, due to their gender or identity, they do have different needs and different perceptions of how they understand their experience in an urban sphere. And this stuff, most of the time, these conditions are not necessarily covered with the physical infrastructure. Yes, physical infrastructure is very important. And most of the time, without physical infrastructure, you won't be able to see a lot of people taking the roads. But part of putting people on the road is providing the social infrastructure so they feel empowered to take the road. Now I want to kind of continue on the ridership and what creates good ridership. And then part of this relates to, again, social infrastructure. And it is definitely the intersection of these both kinds of infrastructures. So we are talking about, when we talk about ridership, I will be referencing some academic articles for this point. A lot of experts talk about the attitude within the community, the social support and the mechanisms that do support cyclists. We are talking about urbanization. And finally, we do talk about good infrastructure. So I will just delve into these things and then touch upon all these points a little bit. So when we talk about the attitude, we are talking about where you're in a neighborhood, where you live with a lot of other people. And most of the time, people riding their bicycles for transit, according to the research, are also commuting to work within the similar neighborhoods. So they live and work in similar enclaves, which makes cycling their most of the time preferred mode of transit. This is mostly this is a little bit of a generalization, but this generalization generally tends to be true for especially non-urban centers in more suburban areas, where you do have a lot of diversity in terms of the workplaces and how they are located. And the attitude of the neighborhood affects in the sense that, hey, if you're in a neighborhood with a lot of car ridership, with a lot of motorists, the attitude in the area, in the region, is not necessarily going to be so supportive of cyclists taking the road. This is due to motorists seeing cyclists as a part of hazard, right? Like, because they have to share the road, and they do think driving next to a cyclist is kind of a security concern sometimes. And this is obviously, again, it intersects with the infrastructure, right? Physical infrastructure, how we can create safe space for cyclists. Second, we are people talking about social support. We already touched upon this a little bit, but essentially social support, when we talk about social support, we are talking about generally bike kitchens, bike hubs, like Cycle York, Bike Sauce in downtown, Charlie's Reviews in downtown, Bike Chain again in downtown. Culture Link has another bike hub right by our neighborhood. It is like only 10 minutes to the York University Kiel campus. It is in the Jane and Finch area. It is Culture Link Bike Hub. So the commonality for all these organizations are they are part of this social support mechanism that essentially we want to surround cyclists with. This is particularly important for people who are not necessarily seen as the primary riders. For the most of the time, there's a lot of connotation of race and culture, obviously, but a lot of people, this is obviously immigrant experience, it's a woman experience, and other people who are not necessarily member of primary ridership, and most of the time this is viewed as white males. These people tend to avoid or not necessarily sometimes disengaged from riding because of the lack of social support and the network. So especially when we look at another important point is the class, right? When we look at the intersection of class and ridership, we do see a lot of the connotation of the class where people do perceive cycling as a hobby that is sometimes upscale or out of their reach. So the importance of bike hubs is that it bridges this gap where a lot of the immigrants, a lot of people who are not necessarily primary riders are feeling more encouraged and safe within these organizations. This is enabled through different programs, right? We do offer group rides, for example. A lot of bike hubs offer group rides. The importance of group rides is you come together as a community where there are people like you, there are people not like you. You come together and you take space on the road, which creates obviously a sense of safety, sense of belonging, and obviously it creates an easier path to the access to the information where you feel more encouraged taking up the road next time, maybe on your own. So social support is really important when we talk about the ridership. Thirdly, we will touch upon dense urbanization because partly it seems like, according to research and according to observations in many urban centers, bike lanes seem to be mostly populated in the urban centers where dense urbanization has already happened because city planners and other planners, other stakeholders see cycling as a way to take the load off the traffic and provide some relief to these areas. Then we will talk about obviously good infrastructure. When we are talking about good infrastructure, we are talking about separated and raised bike roads, like protected bike lanes. We are talking about bike signals. We are talking about parts of the physical infrastructure that makes people feel safe while riding their bike. And obviously, when cities and other entities designing these different levels of physical infrastructure, the importance and position of the stakeholders is really important as well. Because most of the time, these community organizations, where we talked about, these bike hubs, could provide very essential information because they are interacting with a lot of people and sharing their experience as riders in an urban center. And I already touched upon that a little bit when we talked about dense urbanization, but there's also seemed to be a relationship between gentrification and the population of bike lanes and the investment on the bike lanes. In many urban centers, we can obviously count Toronto. We are talking about downtown Toronto. We are talking about the core. We are talking about here San Fran. We are talking about Los Angeles. We are talking about New York. And what's being observed is that a lot of times the infrastructure, the good infrastructure, physical infrastructure we are talking about, comes to the areas where the ridership is already at a good level, where folks have the means to actually use the transit. They do have cars, they do have different ways of transit. So we see the investment being made in areas that are already affluent and in a scope needed less than some folks or some areas where the transit or affordability are the big problems. And we see infrastructure shifting into these areas where affordability is a problem, right? Transit affordability is a problem, where ridership is a problem because of the safety. We see these areas getting these investments only after they started getting gentrified. And when we are talking about gentrification, we're talking about the dislocation of the true owners of the area, of the region, and then changing that with people who can afford higher rents, higher fees of living, higher cost of living, essentially. So that's also another problem when we talk about good infrastructure, is that most of the time, unfortunately, it follows gentrification, which seems to be a big problem, because when we look at the ridership, the neighborhoods that need the ridership most are the neighborhoods who are deprived of these opportunities. So in the final part of my conversation, I want to kind of talk about the cycling infrastructure at York, the physical infrastructure, the social infrastructure, and maybe some of you all heard about the new planned upgrades and planned changes over the 190 square meter area around Keele University campus. So York University is a project where they see the development and revitalization of an area surrounding the Keele campus. So maybe some of you all heard about it, maybe some of you haven't heard about it yet. It's on the website, it's accessible, everyone can take a look and get informed. About the current infrastructure, right? When we talk about the York Keele campus, we do see a lot of students commuting, we do see a lot of students living in the surrounding neighborhoods. We do see a lot of people using the Finch Hydro corridor. Maybe some of you all already use that corridor, where it is essentially a designated path where people can actually bike, walk, or do exercise without the interruption of cars or any other motor vehicles. The problem seems to be, though, York campus, even though it's connected to these bikeways or active routes, it doesn't have a necessarily good connection to the other parts of the city. And most of the time, which creates very unsafe surrounding areas for cyclists and cycling commuters and who are using cycling as a mode of exercise. So essentially the problem seems to be, even though there is a lot of, maybe you guys have seen it already, in the Aviva area, where you enter the campus from the Sentinel area, there's a bike lane, but you follow that bike lane and it doesn't connect to anywhere, right? So another big problem is that the connectivity, that you want to get people on the bikes, that you want to get people to use bikes. Another big problem is that the connectivity of these bikeways and bike roads to the rest of the city or rest of the infrastructure, so that it makes practical and safe using bikes, right? And in my opinion, another disappointing factor is that for the planned upgrades for Living Well Together project, everyone can take a look at the plan, and it's very disappointing to see there is no plan in those plans. There is no planning for actually bike roads, safe cycling infrastructure, safe physical infrastructure, which is kind of interesting because when you read the script, it clearly mentions that they aim people to use walking and cycling as the main modes of transit in this new area. But when you do plan it, you don't include any cycling infrastructure, right? So another problem is that the planning doesn't necessarily follow, right? The intent coming from the community, and then maybe the administration. Not sure about that. So different levels to it, right? And essentially same thing could go with the Finch West subway station and the area developing around the Finch West area. When the upgrades are finished, when the construction is finished, there is a vision of having bike lanes on the both sides of the road. But as of now, in the transition period, it is very unsafe to use that road. And the city and other stakeholders are essentially failing on providing a safe access, safe transition for a lot of these people using this route during their everyday commute. So when we talk about these projects, when we talk about having these transitions, it's really important to understand it's a process, but also different parts of the process require different levels of infrastructure. And when it is lacking, it does create a lot of problems. And these problems are really big problems because it does affect safety. And in Toronto especially, right? Cycling and pedestrian deaths are really high every year. So part of this is on the infrastructure when you have these problems that invite these consequences. But yeah, I hope everyone had some idea of what physical infrastructure is, what social infrastructure is, what we do at Cycle York, and essentially how they could understand and how they could perceive the infrastructure as a whole, because physical infrastructure on its own is unfortunately not enough.